So welcome, everyone. This week's Political Institutions and Political Economy workshop is with Clayton Nall. Clayton's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His research examines how policies that change geographic space change American politics. His broader research interests encompass American political development, public policy, political geography, and political methodology. His book, The Road to Inequality, How the Federal Highway Program Polarized America and Undermined Cities, 2018 with Cambridge University Press, uses a range of new data sources constructed from public archives and databases to examine how the largest public works project in US history created Republican suburbs, increased the urban-suburban political divide, and worsened spatial inequality in the nation's metro areas. He's currently pursuing research broadly addressing the politics of housing, examining how the expression of economic self-interest in local politics interacts with Americans' nationally focused political ideologies. Clayton holds a PhD in political science from Harvard and a BA in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Prior to arriving at UCSB, Clayton was a faculty member at Stanford University. And today's talk will be on housing, and it's co-authored with William Marble, and William is in the peanut gallery today to chime in, perhaps. And the title is Where Self-Interest Trumps Ideology, Liberal Homeowners and Local Opposition to Housing Development. And welcome, Clayton.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff, and it's great. This is my first talk since coronavirus started up, first public talk. It's great to be here.
Excellent. So sometimes we have people break in with questions. They can do that either by raising their hand if I see them, or they could write in the chat box.
Okay.
And we'll probably have a little time at the end for questions as well. So
that sounds great.
Turn it over to you.
I'm happy to be interrupted. So I may defer some questions to the end, but I'm happy to be interrupted. So this is work with my co-author, William Marble, who is also on the job market currently. So if you are at a department that is looking to hire right now, I really encourage you to have a good look at Will's file. I know it's a very tough job market right now, but Will has put together a great record at Stanford. Okay, so this paper is about the problem of self-interest in US politics as applied to the politics of local housing. This is a picture of Tiburon in Marin County, California. So the question that's frequently posed in a lot of American politics research is, are people voting against their self-interest? And now, when this question gets posed, it's frequently set up against a kind of straw man of the straw man of economic voting. So almost every paper that talks about this topic cites this piece by Meltzer and Richard from 1985, which I think I rarely see cited as, in positive terms. Frequently, people are trying to just explain why they were wrong. And so much work in the popular press and in a lot of the political science, takes some version of this question posed by Frank in 2004. What's the matter with Kansas? Well, Gelman and his co-authors asked, what's the matter with Connecticut? Why are all these rich people voting for Democrats? And we might also ask, what's the matter with a place like Marin County? This is a place that's 86% white, an ACS from 2017. It had about a $900,000 median home value. I believe that number has just continued to go up in recent years, and about a $105,000 median income. So half of the population earns a six-figure income. And yet its 2016 vote was 80% Democratic. So the question that would normally be posed at this point is, why are these people voting against their self-interest? Well, Citrin and Green back in 1990 wrote a really widely cited review piece, which looked at a whole range of research showing that, actually there's just minimal evidence that self-interest really plays any role in national elections. So perhaps this isn't all that surprising. Now, why is this? Well, if you take kind of Aiken and Bartel's approach, you might think, well, this is all because of ignorance or myopic retrospective voting. People aren't really paying attention to the bigger economic picture or their own economic picture. Or it's some spin on the idea of false consciousness. So Gaventa's classic work on Appalachian coal miners, argues that they're basically experiencing a false consciousness with respect to their class position. Why am I thinking Robert Frank? I've totally forgotten his first name right now. But the What's the Matter with Kansas in 2004.
Thomas,
thank
Frank.
you. Okay. I've been seeing so much of the Economist's work that I've totally forgotten the name of the political journalist. There have been a few other recent explanations, things like altruistic personality traits. Maybe there's something that's just innately different about some of the high-income folks who are supporting the Democrats or are supporting left causes. And finally, there's the biggie, which is partisanship. That perhaps partisanship is just swamping these things, and people in places like Marin have just formed a kind of democratic identity around culture and other issues.
Clayton, can I ask a question here?
Sure, John.
Just maybe give us a little more foundation on why it is these Marin guys are not voting their self-interest, because to me it looks like they are. They're left Democrats. They care about environment. The Democrats will shut down industries that are far away from them, coal mines and other sort of things, and give them environmental policies they want. So it looks to me entirely in their narrow self-interest to support those sort of policies, because they're not, there's no cost to them of getting the goods they want, right?
John, you're absolutely right. And thanks for the question. I think it's always great when a question foreshadows the rest of the talk. Since the things that you mentioned are so many of these federal changes are distal policies. It may be another way of rephrasing your question. So much of what the federal government decides is remote, or might only apply in a way that has a sort of incidental role in these folks' lives. By contrast, on local issues, including things like zoning control, land use, there really is an acute self-interest at stake. The reason I present this is that I'm really framing the literature as it's been presented to date, which presents this as if it's a puzzle. And I think that
but what's the sort of evidence they give that it's not self-interest? I mean, what is it just declarative that if you're rich, the Democrats are against you? Is that just an assumption, or is there actually a tracing of
I think it really is.
Okay.
And so, I think in particular the idea that, say, think about the changes to the. I don't want to get way too far into this, but think about things like changes to the top marginal rate. All right, so like what is to somebody who's really rich and has basically satisfied all their needs, has a nice house, pulling in a good income, what is a 3 percentage point change in the top marginal rate going to do to their overall economic welfare? It's not going to be that significant. But I think a lot of this literature kind of treats the politics of these national policies, national economic policies, as if they should be significant. And so I think I agree with you. I can definitely stipulate to the point that you're making about the literature in general. And hopefully the rest of the talk will highlight where we should expect to see a self-interest come into play.
Should have included 50 Cent in the. I mean, you saw his quote today, right, or yesterday about this, right? He's voting for Trump because of taxes. He doesn't want to pay higher taxes.
Okay, well, you're right. This is.
There you go, John. There's your answer right there.
But it sounds like there's a look at it looks like the parties are being defined if I understand this strand of literature. I do mostly state and local, but it sounds like these parties are being defined in terms of their tax policies, and it's ignoring all the other stuff that has.
Right, their tax and their welfare policies. That's right.
Okay,
that's right. And I think this was really the the kind of all the arguments that went back and forth. What's the matter with Kansas? Really, they touched on a lot of these issues and how the pure class framing of the parties as left versus right economic parties doesn't capture the full picture. So I totally agree. Yeah. Okay. So one of the key. So where should we be looking for self-interest to play a big role? And the place really is local politics. So much national politics is distal. It involves pretty diffuse costs and benefits. To pick up on John's question, really how much does a rich person suffer if we double the food stamp budget, even if that's all being paid for as we go with higher taxes. It's not likely to really dent their pocketbook all that much. Whereas local politics present proximal and immediate interests that frequently appear in one's own lived experience on housing, education, public safety, and policing. And what Nancy Rosenblum in her terrific and underappreciated book, Good Neighbors, calls the politics of everyday life. This is where the rubber hits the road for a lot of political conflict. Moreover, at the local level, there is this kind of legible policy outcome link that isn't present to nearly the same degree for federal policies. You can typically see, if a local government approves a public housing project, you can see that, and there's a very clear link between that governmental decision and the outcome that you see on the ground. This also, though, presents hard choices for people who may have a personal ideology that conflicts with their localized self-interest. And this is an idea that we've seen so many times before, but the paper that I consider mine most kindred with is this terrific piece by Mary Jackman from 1978, which looks at the support for civil rights among higher education voters. And they support the idea of civil rights in the abstract, don't necessarily support any kind of specific measures or specific applications. So there's a gap between general ideals, which tend to be floating in the kind of federal political sphere, and local application of those ideals. So my focus today will be on what I think is probably the archetypal example of local politics, and that's the politics of land use. Paul Peterson famously argued that this is what local politics is all about. And the primary policy instrument is zoning and permitting, particularly of various land uses that may be more or less desirable. The big players in this world, and for all of you who've been at the previous talks this year, are these home voters, and whose behavior certainly is observationally equivalent with the idea that they're protecting their home value. And then what's the primary instrument for this? Exclusionary zoning, the use of R1 zoning to protect and elevate single-family neighborhoods as the most desired land use. What's the result of this? Well, nationally, this has big implications. One of the implications is that when this exclusionary zoning is applied in high-cost, highly desired, high-productivity real estate markets, such as the Bay Area or various knowledge industry centers of the Northeast, this results in diminished opportunity for people who cannot afford to move to those places for work opportunities. Sia and Moretti in 2017 argued that this may have caused as much as a 2 percentage point drop in national GDP. There's been some controversy about those numbers. Not everybody agrees it was quite that severe, but there are big implications of this. Now, all this sets up liberal homeowners, especially, to face a dilemma. They're supportive of the idea of equal opportunity. They're supportive of the idea of vague idea of housing for all, but they face a dilemma with respect to their personal interests. So today's talk will share a bunch of survey findings from my work with Will, examining the politics of local self-interest. So our primary data source is local housing policy attitudes as measured in the top 20 metropolitan statistical areas. This was collected on a sample from Qualtrics. These top 20 MSAs happen to include a lot of cities in California, a lot of metro areas in California and in the East Coast, as well as a few lower cost real estate markets. But these are, a lot of them are quite high cost real estate markets. The general frame of the paper will examine results using a 2x2 typology that aims to capture this potential cross-pressuring between ideology and homeowner-based self-interest. liberal versus conservative, which will operationalize in terms of people's attitudes towards the general idea of supporting housing for all, and one's housing tenure, whether you're an owner or a renter. The analyses, I'll start by sharing some data from our observational analysis of housing policy attitudes, and then share results of the 2 experiments that we include in the article. The first, it tests a set of persuasion messages. In fact, a lot of the messages that we test in this article are pretty similar to what you hear from the so-called Yes in My Backyard or YIMBY activists in California. And then the second experiment kind of drills down to a more specific level, looking at a specific potential threat of a hypothetical apartment development in one's neighborhood or one's community. Our overall findings are that liberal and conservative homeowners largely agree on a lot of questions related to development, and in fact are much closer together than liberal owners are to liberal renters or to renters generally. And the persuasive and informational interventions that we present happen to have pretty little effect on their attitudes towards building housing in their communities. As I mentioned, this article uses a kind of 2x2 typology to group voters and to frame this idea of cross-pressured voters. All right, so the question we use to do this is the following. Some people say the federal government should ensure that all Americans have housing. Others say that shouldn't be a concern of the federal government. Now, this was a question that had appeared up previously on an economic battery, on other surveys. We think the question has really good properties. A few folks have asked, well, is this just really a question about the federal government and its role or what that should be? And if we look at some of the correlation or the correlates of this question, it's capturing a general kind of economic liberalism that we'd expect this question to capture. So if we ask this question in this MSA sample, 57% of respondents say yes. Okay, and then later in the survey, in the experimental design, we asked this question, thinking about this possibility of more housing in your area, do you support or oppose constructing more apartment-only buildings? And here, a yes answer is strongly or somewhat support. Only 57% of those who favor a housing guarantee want more local apartments. If we look only at homeowners, 50% of metropolitan homeowners, many of whom are Democrats, support a federal guarantee of housing for all, but only 50% of them support local apartment construction, which honestly would be the main vehicle by which folks on the margins of the housing sector would find housing. So how are homeowners dealing with this potential clash of ideology and self-interest? We can look, one way that they're doing it is by supporting policies that are at the federal level or involve extending rights in the housing sphere without supporting developments that would impose concentrated costs. This is very consistent with a lot of what we know about the idea of where you're likely to find support for different public policies. Concentrated, diffuse benefits and concentrated costs, which is the problem we face when we're talking about the effects of housing development, are generally pretty unpopular with people who are the target of the concentrated costs. Whereas diffuse benefits and diffuse costs, which is or concentrated benefits and diffuse costs, which is the case of things like Section 8, have a little bit more political robustness. Okay, so what are these numbers showing us? So these numbers reflect the difference for both liberal homeowners and conservative homeowners from liberal renters. So we're treating liberal renters as the base category. But it's not too often I've seen a cattail in the middle of one of my talks. So you look at things like Section 8, non-discrimination, local rent control, to a lesser degree, housing non-discrimination. Liberal owners and liberal renters are largely in agreement on those types of policies. Conservative owners, here we really see a manifestation of their ideology. So you see a big liberal conservative difference on these questions. Once you start going down the scale, though, and look at things like whether to allow local upzoning, that is, allow zoning that would allow more apartments. or allow open space development, we see really a narrowing of the gap between the liberal and conservative owners. And so these developmental policies don't have the same ideological split among homeowners. I think it's interesting above all of that, if you look at the very last item on the list, relaxing environmental laws to allow more housing development. Now, this is very consistent with what Bill Fischel has argued is one of the major instruments of NIMBYism or home voters today. That is, environmentalism has a lot of appeal to liberals. It's really a safe harbor that they can use to argue against development without highlighting the potential racial disparities that might arise or economic disparities that might arise from their opposition to development. It also surprising to me, the conservative owners were also opposed to relaxing environmental laws in these places. So again, this is all really consistent with what we know about local NIMBYism.
Another question.
Sure.
Just a kind of conceptual question, because I'm trying to think through this in my head. But the framing here is as if there's two things. There's my self-interest and there's my ideology. And I wake up one day and I have a draw from a self-interest distribution and a draw from an ideology distribution. But clearly our ideology comes out of our self-interest to some extent, right? It's not a thing that's just orthogonal to us. It's like I have my self-interest and then my ideology comes out of the air. So I'm trying to think through what question this is asking. In some sense, you're orthogonalizing. I mean, if you were to put this in regression, you're sort of orthogonalizing, right? You're almost saying like it's the part of ideology that's distinct from my self-interest that would be driving this. But I'm just trying to conceptualize this isn't a well-formed question because I'm just trying to organize in my head what the question really is here, because these are interrelated things.
Yes, they are definitely interrelated. And I think that one reason that we did pose the question as we did by focusing on that sort of attitude at the federal level is that if we wouldn't necessarily expect one's home ownership to have an immediate or large effect on one's attitude towards these federal policies or certainly the general policy that's being presented. There's no question that that with respect to the point you raise about ideology being endogenous to one's material experience. Yes, that's true, and we don't think that endogeneity, but whatever results we're presenting here are of course endogenous to all of that. But I don't know how severe that is, particularly the way that we're framing the ideology question. And it's it's really focusing on this pretty abstract, remote federal policy.
I guess so. What you say makes sense to me, but I guess the concern I would have is that whether I'm a homeowner or a renter is correlated with a whole bunch of other things. It's correlated with my income. It's correlated with my profession. It's correlated with other things that are my self-interest too. So in other words, if you could randomly hold all that stuff constant and then sort of shock me, and some people get assigned to live in rental stuff and some people had homes, then that's one thing. But you're not observing in a kind of a experimentally generated variation there. So the thing is that probably picks up income and all those other things.
Right. So yeah. So if you are a renter, there's almost a one-to-one identity between being a renter and living in multifamily housing, for example. And that's something that is, the goal of this paper isn't to isolate the causal effect of ownership versus renting, but we are looking at the heterogeneity and how these different groups are responding to the cues that we provide. And so as I get into the experiments, you'll see the thing we're manipulating is really appeals to these instances of self-interest. And so I think that your point is well taken, but I think that we address it pretty well by through this experimental design that makes appeals to these particular facets of people's self-interest. Okay, and with that, I'm going to move on to talk about experiment one. Okay, so this is really a question that the first of our experiments is a product of some early work that Will and I did starting in 2016. In 2016, late 2016, the Obama administration and the Council of Economic Advisors dropped a sort of 11th hour document dump a few folks in their office, in the economic advisor's office, had been working on a project to try to promote inclusionary zoning and promote a rollback of some of these restrictive zoning policies, particularly in these high productivity metro areas. And so in fall 2016, we ran a study in the Bay Area, which actually shared a snippet from a Politico article that where the Obama administration says we should change our zoning policies, change what we're doing with zoning, and reduce zoning restrictions, and that there are going to be all these additional benefits to our productivity and equality if we do that. And so we ran this in Alameda and Santa Clara counties, which are overwhelmingly Democratic areas. And we did a survey experiment where we randomly assigned people to get this Obama message or a more generic message that was just from economists. And the partisan cue, the economist message had no discernible effect on people's attitudes towards allowing more housing or allowing reduced zoning restrictions in their area. But there were a few issues that we had with our design. I think we didn't do things quite right. So this is our second crack at the question. And so here, what we're basically doing is we're testing. I hope everybody's familiar with the acronym YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard. This is a movement that's really kind of pretty focused in California that argues, uses supply and demand messages to argue that we need to allow for more housing to reduce housing prices. And more housing just has to be built, and then typically this comes with some kind of left message that this is going to allow people who can't afford to live here to live here, and it's going to have egalitarian benefits. How do homeowners reply to these messages? Well, we find that homeowners across the spectrum are, that there's evidence that their self-interest is dominant, and providing this supply and demand logic reduces liberal owners' support for allowing more housing in their communities. If we then mix those messages with those supply and demand messages with appeals to ideology that is the thing about the redistributive benefits of housing, this barely offsets the negative effects. So in experiment one, what we're effectively doing is cross-pressuring homeowners by giving them this supply and demand message on hand and the kind of egalitarian message on the other, cross-pressuring liberal homeowners. All right, so we present 4 different arms of this experimental intervention. The informational treatment is a statement that links housing construction to local housing costs, saying that economists have there's a controlled or no information condition, and then there's a condition that we call the expert condition, which says that economists have shown that building more housing in an area can reduce housing prices, and then followed by a question about whether you support building these different types of housing. At Paul Snyderman's suggestion, we also tried this condition that we call the escape condition, which is combines that expert message, but then also has a sort of out for respondents by saying, but of course, there are lots of other things to consider when it comes to whether to approve housing in a community. All right, and so one goal of this was to kind of present the argument and then kind of do a sleight of hand to change the topic. Also, maybe tell people that in a sort of vacuous way that they are free not to engage in moral desirability responding. Okay, I don't know how well that worked, but you'll see. And then finally, a treatment we call the expert families message, which is this expert message plus info that reducing costs could be good for low and middle income families trying to find housing. This last message is effectively, I think, a distilled, a kind of academic survey experiment version of what the YIMBY activists have been saying in California for some time. Okay, what are the outcomes here? Okay, so we asked people after presenting this prompt, thinking about the possibility of building more housing in your area, do you support or oppose constructing more? And then we give people a set of 5-point support or oppose scales, Likert scales, for 5 different housing types, ranging from single-family housing to apartment-only buildings. We grouped their responses according to whether they rent or own, and by their support for that housing guarantee, so liberal versus conservative. So as a first kind of crack at this, how did this prompt affect people's response on support for single-family housing? This isn't something we explore in great depth in the paper, but I think something that I think YIMBY activists need to think about is there's some real asymmetry in all of this. That if you wanted to find what's the consensus position with respect to building housing, there is support on the left and the right among renters and owners for building more single-family homes. And this is so if you look across, so we have homeowners and renters on the left column here, and then broken down by liberal versus conservative. Then within each of these groups, we report the difference within the homeowner versus renter group. And you can see there's very little difference between the liberals and conservatives in these two groups. And for the most part, the experimental treatments appear to have very little influence on overall support. Keep in mind, a minus 0.16 effect with a 0.10 standard error is pretty tiny on a 5-point scale. Okay. This is not so true of apartment-only buildings. Definitely the least desirable housing land use, or housing-related land use. Here we see overall lower support among all the groups, but there's still much more support among renters. There's very little, in the control condition, very little difference between the renters, liberal and conservative renters. There is a liberal versus conservative difference among homeowners in support for apartment developments in the baseline no information condition. But that difference is still no larger than the difference between liberal homeowners and renters. So there is this additional pretty big gap between liberal and conservative liberal renters and liberal homeowners. The result I really want to draw your attention to is this first result, which is what happens when we just give that supply and demand message. This doesn't have much effect on conservative support for additional apartments in their community, which appears to be at a floor. But it does have a real effect on liberal support for building more apartments. In fact, it pretty much brings their support down to the conservative level, just to talk about the effect of housing development on housing prices.
So the question was, do you support, I'm just looking at the paper again, do you support building more apartments? Does it say who's going to build them, whether it's the government building them or whether it's private developers?
No, and we'll get into that in the next.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to defer discussion. I think the affect towards developers is obviously a big part of the politics of this. If we could defer that to the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk more about it. Yeah. So then what happens when we throw in the escape clause? Well, that kind of thing brings things back up to where they were, which suggests, I'm not quite sure what that suggests. I don't know if the escape clause treatment worked exactly as we expected. But if you provide this, the liberal messaging on what that can do for families, that pretty much, the most it does is brings the liberal homeowners back to where they were to begin with. Okay, so this is not a big effect. And if I were running this campaign as a YIMBY activist, I'd be worried that this message is not working. Experiment 2 takes it from this pretty general level. And John, I do appreciate that your questions have anticipated where my research design went, I think, to a degree. So how are Americans responding to specific types of development proposals? So here we pose the question, which is, informed by previous work, including Michael Hankinson's work. A local group is proposing to build a 120-unit apartment building in your community. Based on this information, would you support or oppose such a project? Here we use a factorial design. We omit a few cells, but that varying additional information in the question. One thing that we vary is distance to the project. No info, which it appears that a lot of respondents actually, if you give them no info about the distance to a project being built in their quote community, they seem to, maybe they're being pretty risk averse and thinking about their losses. They respond pretty negatively, and they seem to be imputing a pretty close distance in their responding. Quarter mile, 2 miles, and then the type of tenants served, either no info given, or market rate, that the apartments will be rented out at a market rate, or half of the units will be built with Section 8, or will be be residents who use Section 8 vouchers. I have to go back to the question wording to confirm whether we actually use the word Section 8, since people might not know what that is. The outcome, again, is a 5-point Likert scale. Our result, again, is that homeownership continues to really be dominating this, the responses to these experimental treatments. And those differences between homeowners and renters are really persistent regardless of ideology. Here we again see really low support for developments among the homeowners. And here, liberal and conservative owners give almost exactly the same response in the baseline condition, or in the no information condition, while renters, liberal and conservative renters, express much higher support. Now, and these results are pretty close to what we saw in the more generalized case. Focusing only on the liberal homeowners here, we do see that these liberal homeowners do seem to be showing a little bit of cross pressuring. So they're responding a bit more positively to proposals for a place that is a low-income apartment, or focused on more on low-income residents. Although they're much happier to see that development be 2 miles away than a quarter mile away. And so I think this setup here, where we're varying space, we're also varying who the residents are, distills some of the conflict that these liberal homeowners must be experiencing. The liberal homeowners are also more likely to, or they're less likely to increase their support for market rate housing. So, this again may be, I think the adverse reaction to market rate developments is in some way capturing these liberal homeowners' liberal or left ideology. So one question that frequently comes up around this talk is, are these development preferences somehow aliasing for other preferences? And as one of the things that's going on here, racial preferences. So we ran these numbers based on some useful data that I've been collecting on every survey since I worked on my paper with Jonathan Momolo on residential sorting, where we asked people where they lived 5 years ago and where they live, or up to 5 years ago, or their most recent place, and where they live today. And so we have data on whether they move to a place that is more or less racially diverse, and by that we're measuring that in terms of the non-white population. So homeowners who moved to places that were more diverse were somewhat more supportive of these dense housing types. Those who moved to a place that was less diverse were less supportive. But again, renters of both types, regardless of where they're moving, were more supportive of dense housing types. So once again, the homeownership seems to be a pretty big factor here. Another concern that we might think about here is, is this all just kind of a California story, and are these California academics just thinking about these super high-priced real estate markets? And here they are doing their me-search again on high-priced real estate. That's not what the rest of the country experiences. So we have a lot of California respondents in our samples, but is there a difference in response to something like a 120 unit apartment in a place that's super low density versus a place that's high density? And this is, so here we're residualizing out the different treatments, and just plotting the sorry, I was just taking a quick look at the chat window to make sure I'm not missing anything. So pro-guarantee rent, here we're plotting out pro-guarantee renters, anti-guarantee renters, pro-guarantee homeowners, and anti-guarantee homeowners. And on the base, on the down at the bottom here, and sorry, I cut this off, is the population density. So this end here, these are respondents in rural or small towns. Here's Bel Air, Palo Alto density. This is the middle of the distribution. And then a place like Miami has about 10,000 persons per square mile. The Chicago Loop is about 25,000. And then Manhattan is up in the 70, 80, 100,000 persons per square mile or higher range. And it really only when you get up into the extremely high density places where not a lot of Americans live, do you see some of these homeowner renter gaps start to diminish. Across many different density levels that encompass almost all of what we consider urban or suburban, there are very similar responses from these two groups, and the separation between the owners and the renters is pretty consistent. So this is I apologize. This is support for the generalized apartment question in experiment 1. This is the same result in experiment 2. There's something wonky going on here with the anti-guarantee renters, and we're not sure quite what's explaining that, and we've really digged into it. If you look, the pro-guarantee renters, regardless of where they're living, are very supportive of developing apartments. The anti-guarantee homeowners are not, but they do converge at high density levels, but there is still that separation. I'm just going to skip over this last part, but what are people thinking about when they're opposing apartments, and what are the things that they're averse to? A lot of the things that they're averse to appear to be just negative externalities of apartment development. They're opposed to traffic, crowding. They're concerned about what apartments do to amenities. And these concerns arise from both renters and owners, although renters are much less likely to mention each of these causes as things to be concerned about with apartments. Renters are much more likely to talk in positive terms about how apartment development could provide more affordability. So to wrap up, economic self-interest appears to play a minimal role in vote choice and policy attitudes when we look at data from the national level. The problem is that so much of national politics involves pretty low stakes. By contrast, local politics is proximal. The policy consequences are pretty clear. This relationship between policies and outcomes is far more legible and obvious at the local level. Now, liberal homeowners we've shown are cross pressure, do embrace redistributive housing policies. I think for those of you who are following all the housing initiatives that we have on the ballot in California right now, I think we can expect to see a lot more homeowners supporting rent control than other policies that might involve any kind of additional tax burden or additional development. On development, though, liberal homeowners look an awful lot like conservatives, and in fact, the more specific you get, the more they seem to look like conservatives. They do respond to some appeals to their ideology, particularly on things like building low-income housing, but they still express NIMBY behavior. Messaging and persuasion can evoke some cross-pressured responses from these liberal homeowners. I think it's worth noting right here that these are, of course, stated preferences. So if we start to look at things like participatory biases that Katie Einstein, of course, has looked at a lot in her work, that makes the implications of these stated preferences even more important, because it's these homeowners who are the ones showing up for meetings. When they are showing up for meetings, they're doing so not typically to express their liberal preferences around housing, but to express conservative preferences. I think we do need to pay attention to, when we are studying these kinds of participatory inequalities and paying attention to home voters' influence in local politics, looking at these latent preferences matters a lot in determining how local politics is likely to develop. Now with that, I'm happy to open up for more questions.
So part of it is somebody who spent a lot of time doing work on state and local governments. And, people have been running regressions looking at referendum voting for since the 1970s, at least going back to Deakin and Shapiro. I would say that this is going to be too strong, but I would say that essentially everybody who does that knows that self-interest matters. There's no doubt in anybody's mind that economic factors play a role in voting on a whole host of state and local issues. Whether it's for Matt Kahn and I did a paper on environmental voting, and it's very clear that people who sort of don't have to pay the economic cost of environmental measures are more likely to support it, and so forth and so on. So what I'm trying to think of here is what. So you have a lot of cool stuff here. So I'm trying to think about, okay, what is the new thing here? So for me, just to give you one person's feedback, the notion that people actually care about their economic interests in state and local elections is not surprising. In fact, I think we probably know that. What seems to me is more interesting here in some ways is when do they care? Because they're trading off different things, right? They have their ideological notions of what they'd like things to do. So I'm wondering if maybe an alternative way to frame this is not so much do people pay attention to their economic interests, because I would say they do, but it's when do those become overriding to people, and when are they willing to pay something on an economic side of things to advance their social goals in some way, because you're sort of getting around the edges of that with some of these interesting interventions. You're looking at sort of where they hear from people about different things and so forth, and how far away they are and so forth. I wonder if it might be interesting to press more into that dimension, rather than in saying, well, do people care about their economic interest?
No, I think that's a really valuable point with respect to the framing of the work. I think the results show that, and I think the contribution of the paper is that. Is to look at how people move from their reified ideologies and down to a place where the chips are down, which I think a lot of the work that has focused exclusively on local politics maybe hasn't focused as much on for a long time we were calling this cross-pressuring. I think in the paper we might call it cross-pressuring. There's certainly there's a tension there, which I think in the nature of that tension and how people reconcile the tensions is something that I'm working on now with Will on some other projects for my book project, which is going to be based off of a lot of the empirics here. So I think, yes, I mean, perhaps in the setup to the talk and in the setup of the paper, we are maybe protesting too much about the literature on self-interest. That this is a this is a story about tensions between the self-interest and people's pretty well developed informed ideologies formed on the national stage.
Yeah. So I like that a lot, and I would just again give you feedback, because I always like to get feedback from audience members, but it's the reconciling part that is really interesting to me, because if you can think of a lot of issues we have to deal with as a collective, as a country, as a state, as a city, require us to make some level of individual sacrifices to achieve some collective goods, right? So the question is, in a democracy, how do you get people to do that? Under what circumstances are they willing to do that, and are they not? Seems to me a really big central question, which is at the heart of what you're doing here. So I would like, especially if your book's going to do more about that, sort of talking about, well, when are people willing to overlook their economic interests, and when are they not? Because that seems to be tapping into a big issue, at least it's an issue of interest to me.
Right, and so I think maybe, so I've read a lot of the literature that you referenced with respect to state and local voting, and so I think right, and a lot of it doesn't necessarily attack the problem from the viewpoint of looking at people having these kinds of commitments that they've formed in thinking about national politics. They tell themselves that they're liberals. They put up their Black Lives Matter sign on their front lawn in their R1 neighborhood. And I was just driving through Montecito, which is Oprah, it's Oprah and, Meghan and Harry just moved in there. It's like very, very rich estate-based area. And there are all these BLM signs all over the place. And, if I propose building an apartment building in Montecito in that particular neighborhood, people develop, I think a part of the story that we didn't delve into all that much in this paper is that there is definitely going to be a a huge motivated reasoning story to be told here. And it's one that, I think, things like environmentalism, opposing real estate developers and saying that real estate developers are the villains versus homeowners. This is one way that NIMBY homeowners reconcile their opposition to local development. But I'm happy to take some other comments and questions now.
Just one more follow up on that. Just a suggestion, a thing you could look at is that it'd be interesting to know you have variation within your sample too. So it'd be interesting to know there are some people in your sample presumably who ignore their self-interest and pay more attention to their ideological interest. It might be interesting to break those guys out and see are they different in some respect? Are they different in terms of some demographics? I don't know what kind of data you have in there, but that might give us a lens of which type of people seem to be willing to make these trade-offs and which are not.
Yeah,
that is push a little bit back from the means, but get more into the variation.
Yeah, thanks.
On this topic, on this topic, I was thinking as Jen was asking his questions, and as I was thinking a little bit about your talk and what John's question is about, is this particular to liberals, right? This notion, this cross pressure, this virtue signaling, right? Is it And then I tried to think about, are there conservatives and conservative issues where there would be this cross pressure too?
Yeah.
And the one that popped into my mind was, for a lot of low-income conservatives, Obamacare, right, would be one, for example, where they, would ideologically be in favor of, sort of the Trump philosophy, but to do so would be contra to their self-interested preferences, right? The need for healthcare. So I don't know if people have examined that at all, or if that sort of issue pops up much.
No, that's a good example of something that definitely is an example of personal self-interest where there might be some tension. When Will and I posted, I think, our latest version of this paper on Twitter, Matt Iglesias, who has written a lot about these issues for Vox, responded by saying, well, I don't know why you're not looking at conservative homeowners and their ostensible libertarian views on property. Why aren't they supporting housing zoning deregulation? And it turns out, so if you go look into our crosstabs of who falls into the pro zoning reform, but also anti housing guarantee cell, it's something. I believe it might be less than 10% of the overall sample falls into that cell. Overwhelmingly, conservatives make an exception for zoning when it comes and for allowing exclusionary zoning. So there just really aren't. I think this is something we know in other spheres. There just really aren't libertarians. Libertarians are a little bit of a unicorn. They don't really exist in the real world.
Do you think BLM is a good example here? I mean, you mentioned BLM, right? And you can imagine people being receptive to the idea of reparations in some form, right?
Yeah.
But when it touches on something that involves them, like, I don't know, schools, right? They might be very different. So BLM by itself might involve drilling down and thinking about different kinds of policies.
Yeah, so it's, obviously I've been dealing with the transition and COVID and everything else before the world blew up. I didn't have this on my list of things to explore, but I think now that BLM is this kind of anchoring national issue, and there's a national discussion about what demands are being made. I think that it presents an opportunity to examine more of this kind of cross-pressuring. I think that supporting reparations, it's obviously there would be a big fiscal bill or a big federal bill associated with reparations, but it's still a pretty diffuse cost for a lot of these wealthy homeowners. Yeah. They aren't going to see anything in their daily lives that will substantially change as a result of if we decided to pay reparations commensurate with the interest adjusted or inflation adjusted reparations that we should have provided during Reconstruction. Even if it was a massive bill, it's still not something that would really affect the lives of people living in segregated white neighborhoods.
So in some of my work in civil rights in Congress, right, the beginning of the split between Republicans and Northern Democrats, starts in really in the mid 1960s, 66 or so, around fair housing, right? And as it became clear that some of these policies would affect Northern liberals and Northern conservatives, you begin to see some of the split occurring. And then the big split occurs, of course, in the early 70s on busing, right? That's where, some of the things that probably you talked about early, right? On civil rights, it was, busing was the 1970s and big fights on busing. Schools, you might imagine, I've not done any work on schools. I don't know where the issue of schools is today. I mean, that's kind of that's a sub-state level, right? That's a local level issue. I rarely pay attention to school board elections and whatnot. I don't know really what they're running on. What is it that they're running on? I wonder.
I don't know how much, in California at least, I don't know how much discretion school boards really have over a lot of policies. And schools are, I think, another clear example that's pretty closely tied in with the nature of housing stock and housing, zoning. I think they're almost inseparable issues, and especially when you look at something like, what makes a neighborhood a good neighborhood? Well, that's almost always coincides with neighborhoods, the schools that are labeled as good schools. And what's the best predictor of whether a school is labeled a good school? Well, I think I ran some numbers off of the California school testing data. The correlation between the percentage of adults with a BA and school scores in California is 0.8, which is almost that's higher than almost anything you ever get in any analysis anywhere.
Right.
I mean, it's basically the same variable, and so that's so the peer effects in schools that people are paying to experience are a product of these housing decisions.
Well, Clayton, if I can pull you back to housing, I'm Dowell Myers. I'm sorry, I got to the seminar a little bit 10 minutes late because I had trouble getting access. But I did get a copy of your paper earlier from Jeff. So I'm a professor in planning and also demography here in the Price School.
Great.
And I've done some experimental designs also. But your work's very discouraging because it looks like there's no solution to our housing problem. And some of us are trying hard to figure out why is it so hard for us to build housing? And you're putting your finger on a lot of the reasons why. I would like to see how you might frame that more broadly, and you could ask a historical question as to so what changed. Jeff already got to it with like some of the general civil rights issues that might have made voters more touchy about issues than before. After the 70s, it got more and more difficult. It could be maybe that people are better organized, resistance is more organized, but I think it's also, there's a number of other issues. It's like, how stigmatized is the idea of housing? In all of your prompts, you leave it open for people to picture, imagine what it is that's coming in. Yeah. 130 units or whatever it was, that's a pretty big project. That's a lot of traffic. And I imagine this big, ugly monster. If you showed them pictures, you could look at like more attractive, less attractive, Soviet bloc apartments versus, private market designed apartments. But the key is like, what is it?
Yeah, I think the idea that there are different housing forms that are stigmatized or not, and this is one of the levers that certainly the pro-housing activists, people working in the applied space have been really concerned with and trying to focus on, trying to make housing developments attractive. I think Katie Einstein's book does a great job of talking about the lengths to which developers will go to satisfy communities with respect to the aesthetic appearance of housing. How much does that actually matter in terms of the response that people are going to have to housing? Ultimately, the more units you try to put into a place, the more people are going to object. Sometimes the number of units doesn't even have to be that many. The YIMBYs in California right now are all on Twitter about Robert Reich, Robert Reich, is that his name's the former labor secretary, Robert Reich, yeah. Liberal activist, is wrote a letter opposing the development of 2 affordable housing units in his neighborhood, and this is there seems to be no scale that is too small for folks who oppose the development of deliberately affordable housing or housing with any kind of density.
Clayton, I just wanted to remark on the finding that you had about the distance of apartment complexes to the respondent's home. And thinking about it as a version of Paul's out option or escape option, since it is in essence allowing them to push it further and further out. And when I think of some Californian suburban neighborhoods, they often range between 10 to 20 square miles. So 2 miles out is basically saying, I'm okay with this so long as it's on the periphery of the city, as far away as possible. I'm wondering kind of how you interpret that and what the distance does to kind of provide some sort of escape, what your perception or perspective is of that.
Well, I think when you do get to that point of a 2-mile limit, there may be, we weren't all that clear about this falling within your municipality. There may still be fiscal implications of allowing that kind of development in your community for the tax base and things like that. So there is still possibly a fiscal logic to opposing that kind of housing if you're thinking about your self-interest. But there is no question, as you say, that if something's 2 miles away, it's far enough away not to really impinge on anyone's daily life in a meaningful way. And of course, this is exactly the out that liberal homeowners in places like Palo Alto use when they're arguing that they're not really opposed to housing. They just think that the housing that's being proposed in their neighborhood is just in the wrong place, that there would be much better places, which almost invariably happen to be some distance away from their neighborhood.
Leaning back to your other work, to me, it almost seems as if this pushing further and further away or finding the ideal zone reminds me of kind of the ideal location of a freeway, this idea of specialized districts for high density housing for people in that group. And it doesn't have the racial tinge of redlining per se, but it almost does have kind of a class bias that mimics that style. And so I guess if you had the opportunity to do another experiment, I'd also see how these liberal respondents feel about people from other social classes in terms of their own biases there, or maybe you've already done that.
Well, I don't have something that is nicely designed as what you're proposing, but Will and I we asked people, and Will can jump in and correct me if I have this wrong, but I believe this came off an open-ended thing that we did in this Bay Area study that we filed, George, because of some design issues. But we asked people, what comes to mind when you're thinking about apartments? So on the positive side, people talk about affordability. They talk about how apartments are occupied by low-income people, students. There's traffic. There's crime, and so on. Families, as you can see, is pretty small here.
Yeah.
If you talk about single-family homes, actually, an awful lot of young families live in apartments. It's a pretty, it's pretty important housing for a lot of young families. And in fact, in places like California, where a lot of the demographic growth is among people who have a lot of kids. Like they're living in single family homes in the suburbs, which is a graying population. It's either gray or rich, the single family housing. So, but single family homes are associated with families, neighborhood, nice people, community is a word that you will not use to describe apartments. So this is obviously a hand-wavy response to your question, but I think this is, there is more opportunity to delve into the connotations associated with apartments versus single family homes. There's no question that there's really bipartisan, across all these classes, people love single family homes. This is something I think the urbanists, the YIMBYs in California are urbanists, but they have not come to grips with the idea that even the people who are stuck living in apartments love the idea of building more single family homes in California. Where are all those single family homes going to go? And this explains why, I think this helps to explain why Gavin Newsom is not sticking his neck out to challenge all this housing construction happening on the urban wilderness interface. He's not really sticking his neck out to block more single family development in sprawl zones. This is, the polling shows that this is what a lot of people like, even though it's something that I think the YIMBYs have not come to grips with.
Clayton.
Yes.
Hi, good to see you here.
Good to see you, Brian.
Yeah, thank you for the nice presentation and good research. I have two questions which are related to each other. One is, so I can see John's reaction that, you set up this paper as if you're testing the conflict between ideology and self-interest. But even if I haven't studied anything in the PhD program, I can imagine that once you become a homeowner, whether you are liberal or conservative, probably you're less likely to support dense housing if you perceive that that's gonna suppress your housing values. So, I am wondering whether the who of the paper is just too large. You set up the paper saying that self-interest has not been really not shown to matter in political attitudes, but we show that even for liberal homeowners it matters. But so that's my first question. Second question is, if I read your experimental questionnaire correctly, then did you ask that economists say that more construction of housing in your area will decrease your property values? Did you ask that? And no. What?
Your first point is well taken. I think we'll dig into some of the heterogeneity in these groups some more. The second point is we don't say housing prices, or we don't say your home values. We say that this can reduce housing prices. And
reduce.
Yeah, yes, it can reduce.
No homeowner wants that.
Okay, then my question is, what if we have, I know that it's done, but what if we have asked, hey, economists say that more housing construction may boost your property values, or it doesn't decrease, it doesn't reduce property values, then I wonder whether liberal homeowners would support them more than conservative homeowners, because it's because I guess what I have in my mind is that if it comes to housing price depreciation, then no one wants that, whether you are liberal or conservative. And I know that that's major finding of your paper, but if we frame this in a different way, that it doesn't really harm your properties, and that's what economists say, then I wonder whether liberal homeowners would be more likely to support that proposal than conservative.
Yeah. So, we do see, so that, I think part of the answer to that question, or at least, what we've presented in the paper, the experiment in the paper is a one-sided experiment. And what you're proposing is that we almost do a symmetric, the other side of the experiment. So we're highlighting losses, but we're not highlighting maybe things aren't going to be all that that or reinforcing what we think is being implied by the control condition. And the control condition is just a no information condition. It's not a condition that attempts to convince anybody that their home values are safe. It just doesn't highlight that their home values might change or their housing prices might change. So I think that's a really good point. Effectively, that would provide more experimental content to what we might consider to be the mirror side of the prompt that we provided. How much that would budge liberal homeowners from where they stand under the no information control condition, I think is a good question. Yeah. And congratulations on your little one.
Thank you.
Al, did you want to ask something here?
No, really, very stimulating talk, and I'm looking for solutions. I'm trying to figure out what can we do. But first off, Brian raised a good topic there, a good issue. Economists always frame it in terms of prices. That's just how they frame things.
Yeah.
There's also a question of supply. Is there enough housing for the people who need it, just in quantity?
Yeah.
And that you might get different responses if you try to approach it that way. Rather than
you just
on
need
price.
Well, yeah. I will
There's
say
such
this
an
is,
acute shortage.
and that's a fair point. It's one that when we see Gavin Newsom talk about the issue, so I shouldn't be beating up on the governor as much as I am here, but he is when he talks about the issue, he talks about the need for X number of homes. He says we need 3.5 million homes. That's a number that came out of a McKinsey report that was published.
It's fictitious. It's a fictitious number.
Right. No, I know that it is, and we do need a lot more homes, but it was basically conjured off of New York City as a baseline,
right?
For how things should be happening here, and there's no reason to think that we should be doing things just like New York City. But it's an appealing number to throw that number around. Now, it also is a pretty unattainable number in the near future. But it is, I think, it does speak to your point that if we didn't talk about these things in terms of the prices, but instead just talked about the scarcity of housing, the difficulty of people even finding a place.
Right.
Obviously, I mean, the subtext there is difficulty of finding a place at a price they can afford.
No, there's an absolute difficulty.
But there is, I think, probably going to be a difference in the response that you get from respondents over if you just drop the price talk. Yeah.
But yeah, so my estimate's like 2.8 million. That's the second highest estimate in California. Yeah. But mine's grounded. Just this, I just want to think about in terms of counterfactuals. It sounds like we can't build anything unless we segregate, and we have zones of established homes that nobody will touch. Then we have new build zones. The new build zones are, however, outlying areas, and all the climate change legislation was fighting against building outward. So they want you to build inward. Well, inward is where all the resistance is. So you really are doing research at a point in time where there's a conflict of mega policy clash between climate change versus housing supply.
Yeah.
And we're getting neither accomplished.
No.
So that's interesting right there. That conflict is it, and you haven't got any pathway identified. It may be that it's a choice between segregation, though, not integration, but segregation and housing, one or the other. And you could define it that way and ask your respondents that way. These liberals, they would never support segregation goals. But then if you try to, it would be interesting to force them to see, well, then how much would they be willing to accept in the way of apartments? And how close? And it was interesting your point that if you don't give them any kind of distance, information, they assume it's right next door. They're very risk averse. So the thing is, we used to build cities by redeveloping old areas at higher density. But maybe we're reached the point where with local democracy, you can't rebuild anything unless you go outside where there are no neighbors to complain. And I mean, it's a caricature, but I don't know how political scientists can study that rationally, but you can pose the choices on these extremes and see, talk about counter pressures. Boy, I don't know what these liberals do.
If I can add on to Dal's point, I mean, I like this idea of thinking about, okay, people are going to pay attention to their economic interests. There's nothing wrong with that. Everybody does that, but that's obviously a barrier to advancing some of these goals. And the question then really is, okay, what can be done about it? What things will they go for? I think sometimes when I read these literatures about development, I think people sometimes underplay the significance of homes to people's economic livelihood. For most people, this is their main, by far overwhelming amount of their wealth is there. If you build a multifamily housing in their neighborhood, you're going to cut 10% or 20% of their wealth, perhaps, and they're highly levered. I mean, this is not like an abstract thing for some people. This is a hugely important economic consequence. So it's not trivial to say, well, you're just being selfish. No, it's your livelihood, and perhaps this is your retirement income and so forth. But it would be interesting if you could think of it so as economists, we would think about, okay, if you want to build into multifamily housing, how can you abate the cost to these people? So you're not asking the people right around here to pay for it all in terms of their home values, but you somehow compensate them in some way so that they feel like they're okay and they're doing their share, but the people 2 miles away don't get off scot-free. So it might be interesting to know, are there any kind of policy things on the table, and see if people like those ideas, right? Do people go for those? Because we don't really know what they'll go for here.
Right, and so Liz Gerber, and some of her work on this topic talks about these various side payments and how they can make projects more attractive. Obviously, one of the policy solutions that sounds an awful lot like what you're proposing is Bill Fischel's idea of home equity insurance, or providing some sort of maybe short-term home equity guarantee, which even if offered on a short-term basis, probably would avoid some of the cascade effects that might arise around apartment buildings. The point at which apartment buildings are scariest is when they haven't yet been built. Usually, once they get built, they, particularly if they're nice and if they're being built in an area with poor housing stock, or older or less highly maintained housing stock, they can actually boost home values. I think that Rebecca Diamond's work shows that the apartment development isn't always bad for home values. So I do think, though, that the tension that Dell raises is a really important one to consider, that the choice we face may very well is going to be between segregation and redevelopment. I'm heartened maybe a little bit by some of the work that Elizabeth Cohen has done, I think, to dispel some of the caricatures of the period of urban renewal that have appeared in historical literature. What she shows in her work on urban redevelopment in New Haven and Boston is that actually urban redevelopment actually often had a lot of local support, including from African American communities that saw the value in having some amount of investment, and frequently that redevelopment was seen as having great benefit to the local community. I really recommend, if anyone who hasn't read it, to check out her book on Edward Logue, who was the urban renewal boss in New Haven and Boston for a number of years. I think, these are all great things to consider. This has all been great feedback.
So Brian asked another question, and it's really just about the question wording a little bit and the manipulation. 150 units sounds like a lot. He's curious if the support will be more positive or salient if it was small and medium-sized units.
Right. So I know we tinkered around a lot with piloting of this study, and maybe this would be a good point. If Will remembers exactly what we did test out some different wording and unit sizes here. I think including 60 units. 120 units is large. I don't know how much kind of intuition people have around something like 120 versus 60. In any case, 120 it's a decent sized apartment complex, however you think about it. We tried to really kind of split the middle in terms of whether urban respondents and more rural respondents, still seeing that development as a substantial one. Yes, I'm sure that there would be some effects associated with the massing of the development.
What if you change the units to condominiums? instead of
There's somewhat-
apartments.
There's somewhat more support for condominiums. Apartments are definitely the least liked form of housing development. There's more support for mixed use. There's more support for condos, although there's still a big homeowner renter divide with respect to development of condos and townhomes. And we know from local NIMBYism research that condos are frequently received about as well as apartments are. In wealthy areas, especially, they're associated with the arrival of young wealth, young people with tech money.
Any other questions? We have a couple minutes left if we want to ask any final things.
I know, Will, if I've forgotten anything or misspoken at all.
I don't think so. I don't remember exactly what all the pre-tests we did were. I'm looking through our Dropbox folder to see if I can find anything relevant, but I think you basically covered what I would have said.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much, everybody, for your feedback.
Yeah.
We, Will and I are now working on a project that we think will be relevant to whatever the outcome is of Prop 19, which is on the ballot this year. One of the things that John mentioned in his last round of comments was that homeowners are frequently, that their homes are their main asset, and that they're frequently highly leveraged. But there's some variance in that, and even here in California, maybe not so much in the highest end real estate markets where people are highly leveraged if they've bought their homes recently. But there's a class of owners who got their house from their parents, who are maybe maintaining it maybe using it as a rental property some of the time, or have inherited their home and are living in a neighborhood that has otherwise become a much richer neighborhood than it was when they grew up. That is a variation on home ownership and ownership of that asset class that is, I think, likely to yield different behavioral outcomes and different attitudinal outcomes than, say, somebody who just bought a home and is super leveraged. But we're digging into that now in some of the data from county deed registers, and trying to replicate some of the cool work that the LA Times did on inherited property in California. So future
Pipe workshop.
future, yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Clayton. This was a great
Thanks a lot, Jeff,
presentation.
for having me, and thanks
absolutely.
everybody for your comments and questions.
Very
And
interesting.
I'm glad to have you up the road a bit.
Yeah.
Or down the
We should-
road, right? Down the road.
Up the road.
Up the road. Okay. I don't. Yeah.
The American
I still don't
Riviera.
know spatially California very well.
Okay.
Nearby. How about that?
Yeah. All right. Take care.
Thanks.